Chapter 6 disclaimer. Bob and Alex sat in an announcer's booth and smiled brightly for the camera. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first, and most likely last, Hogwarts Day Parade, Alex told the viewing audience. The organizers have a real treat for us today, Bob said, looking down the parade route. And it looks like they're starting things off with a real eye-catcher. Here comes the first float. Ah, wonderful, Alex said as she spotted it. A nice tribute to the leader of the light, Albus Dumbledore. The camera swung around and zoomed in. Upon the float were capering Death-Eaters chasing young, attractive girls, and a few boys who were in various states of undress. Behind them were the smouldering ruins of what looked like the float builder's interpretation of the Ministry of Magic. Over the float was a banner that read, "And it was all thanks to Albus." "That must have taken some work," Bob commented. "True, and I think we blew our disclaimer budget on this little party," Alex muttered. "That, or your chocolate bars," Bob said, scowling. He couldn't believe he'd fallen for the old Peems gag again. "Don't start," she snapped. "Besides, here comes the next float. Oh, and this one's a doozy, folks. The organizers have allowed the house elves to create their own float. How's that for equal rights?" Bob asked. "Not bad, though I'm not sure letting Dobby and Creature build it was such a great idea," Alex said as she squinted at the float. "A bit perverse, isn't it?" At the front of the float was Lucius Malfoy. He was naked on his hands and knees with a gag in his mouth. Behind him was a giant dildo, doing what dildos do, while Dobby stood back, wielding a whip on the man. Behind him stood Creature, heating a branding iron and cackling madly. "Perverse! Maybe. But then this is a disclaimer," Bob reminded her. Alex hummed in agreement. "Oh, look! The Parade Queen's float is next. Isn't that lovely? As the Queen is Millicent Bulstrode." "Lovely isn't a word I'd use," Bob quipped. "But at least in this chapter she does put one nagging question to rest." "What nagging question is that?" Alex asked as she watched the Queen's float go by, and shook her head as the Queen flipped the audience the bird. "That she really doesn't have balls, as many suspected," he told her, and casually sent an obscene gesture back at the girl. "She could have tucked them back, you know." "I hadn't thought of that," Bob said, shaking his head. "No matter, it's time to wrap this up. The final float is rolling up now. Ladies and gentlemen, give a warm welcome the students of Gryffindor, Hufflepuff, and Ravenclaw." The float rolled past the booth, loaded down with students who danced and waved to the crowd. "Oh, now that's a fantastic way to end a parade," Alex said, wiping away a tear as she pointed. Attached to the rear of the float was a hugely inflated Voldemort singing, "I'm Henry VIII, I am," in a rich baritone. Attached to his head and streaming up behind him was a banner that read, "They don't own Harry Potter. Ya nitwits. Harry Grimmauld Place." Harry Potter said, "We need to stay in the house unless we are on house business." Creature looked up from the cauldron he was stirring. It contained a house elf potion that he had been hoping to try for years. "Yeah, and we're doing House of Black business. Besides, Master didn't name you head elf." Creature wasn't named head elf either, Dobby shot back. Creature glared at Dobby. "You know what this means. We need to please Master until he makes his choice." Dobby blinked and stared at Creature in surprise. He had forgotten about that. He and Creature were now in competition for the position of head elf. "Dobby will prove he is a better elf than nasty Creature." The little elf gestured, and a small axe appeared in his hand. Then he vanished from sight. "Crazy elf," muttered Creature. "My potion will prove that Creature is the best." The elf crooned to the cauldron and stirred it harder, then cocked his head slightly. "Needs a few more spleens from dead fishes. Hogwarts, half an hour later, the sorting." "Seems to be taking longer than usual, doesn't it?" "That's your stomach talking," Hermione quipped. "I'm sure the first years will be along shortly. The Great Hall was filled with chattering students, though they seemed a bit louder than usual this year." Many were still retelling the incident with the Express, going over the gory details bit by bit, doing their best to gross each other out. Hagrid and Minerva stepped out into the grotto and looked down on the new first-year students as she did every year. This time, however, something was amiss. Shaking her head at the sight before her, she turned to Hagrid. "What happened?" she sputtered. "The boats sank. It was the strangest thing. One minute we was floating along as usual, the next we started sinking. I had a heck of a time convincing the squid to stop playing with the children long enough to get them all ashore," the giant man told her as he tried to wring out the sleeves of his coat. "The little tykes are scared to death of the squid now, and I don't imagine they'll be wanting to go swimming any time soon either. Between the accident with the express and now this, let's hope we've had our bumps for the year," she muttered as she turned to the frightened, soaked students to begin her speech. "Hogwarts, the late." Dobby stood on the shore, staring towards the grotto the students had disappeared into. He looked down at the axe in his hand and smiled. "So, Creature thought Harry Potter liked him more because he got to pluck the headmaster?" Dobby snorted. "He'd show the twisted little elf and help Harry Potter create a little mischief while he was at it." He looked up at the school and sighed. He couldn't wait to tell Creature what he'd done. But first, there was one more task he needed to do. Dobby grinned maniacally and vanished with a small pop. Hogwarts breakfast. Ron nudged Harry to get his attention. "Hermione and I have heard from the Ravenclaw and Hufflepuff prefects. Everyone knows the plan and is on board. Well, everyone but the first years." Harry nodded, then looked at Hermione, who sat across from them. She shrugged. "It's up to you now. Let's get this revolt started." Harry shook his head. "You're all nuts. Have I told you that?" "A few times, yes. Now get going," Ron said, nudging him again. Grabbing a last slice of toast, Harry stood up and noticed that conversations at the Gryffindor, Hufflepuff, and Ravenclaw tables stopped and all eyes turned toward him. Smiling slightly, he waved and left the great hall, toast in hand, whistling a jaunty tune. Once he'd gone, Hermione looked at Ron, then pushed her teacup away. "We'd better get to class." Grabbing her book bag, she stood up. Transfiguration. "This should be fun," Ron said as he put his fork down and stood. He looked around as they walked towards the exit and noticed other students getting up and heading to class. "She's going to have kittens, you know." "Probably. Too bad Colin's not in our class. He could snap a few pictures," Hermione said, grinning. "You know, you sure have changed," he told her. "There was a time not too long ago you'd have been having a litter right beside McGonagall." She shrugged. "We all have to grow up sometime, Ron. So how long until they send for the cavalry?" As they walked down the hall, they took bets on how long it would take them to find Harry. Harry, meanwhile, was enjoying a beautiful morning. The lake was afire with reflected sunlight. Puffy clouds scurried across the sky, and his firebolt was performing beautifully. After last year, he never thought he'd see his broom again. Late last night, when he'd entered his dorm room, he'd found it on his bed, with a note from Dobby. The elf had found the broom for him, though he wasn't sure when. He'd have to talk to him about that. Or maybe not. He'd noticed at the feast that Umbridge was back this year to teach defense. He was sure the old toad hadn't voluntarily give the elf the broom. Maybe he'd give Dobby a gift rather than a firm talking to. Shrugging the thought away, he put his firebolt through its paces. He might not be playing Quidditch anymore, thanks to his band, but nothing was said about flying for pleasure. Some time later, he noticed several people on the pitch below him, waving and shouting. Squinting slightly, he noticed one bald head that stood out and couldn't help but grin. Ignoring those below, he did a lazy spiral turn and shot off in the opposite direction, wondering if he could buy a snitch just to keep in practice. Circling the pitch, he flew slowly over the group below him. "Harry Potter, you come down here this instant!" Dumbledore bellowed, obviously using a sonorous charm. Harry tapped his ear and shook his head. Then, shrugging, he flew off. A few minutes later, he noticed an old school broom laboring to catch up with him. He slowed up slightly, then nearly fell off his broom at what he saw. Dumbledore, on a broom! The headmaster caught up with him, and they flew side by side for a few moments. "Lovely morning for a flight," Dumbledore said conversationally. "It is, yes." "I've missed it," Harry replied. "I'm sure, however. Can you explain how you got your firebolt back?" He shrugged. "I went up to the dorm late last night, and it was on my bed." "Really? So you have no idea how Professor Umbridge ended up chained in her closet, where she'd been keeping your firebolt?" Harry's eyes widened. "What? Chained?" "Yes. We looked for her this morning when she didn't show up for the staff meeting. She couldn't explain how she ended up there. Wait, back up. She chained up my firebolt." He glared at the headmaster. "Do you have any idea what this broom means to me? Or how much it cost? If there's even a scratch on it, she's going to pay for it. When he began talking about hiring a solicitor to sue the school and Umbridge for property damage, the headmaster cleared his throat. "Harry, why did you not come down when I asked?" he asked, talking loudly to be heard over the boys' muttering. Harry stopped mid-rant and looked at Dumbledore. "To be honest, Headmaster, I didn't recognize you. If you don't mind my asking, what happened to your hair? And your beard? Bald just doesn't suit you." He squinted at him and tilted his head to the side. "Red eyes, no nose, and you could be Voldemort." Dumbledore scowled. "You're missing class, Mr. Potter." Harry pushed his lower lip out in a pout. "Would you expel me for it? Of course not. In that case—" His carefree laughter drifted back to Dumbledore, and the man frowned. The old-school broom couldn't keep up. Neither could the old-school headmaster, he admitted to himself. He could feel muscles cramping in his legs and back. Sighing heavily, he headed for the pitch and landed a little more roughly than he'd hoped. Grunting at the impact, he climbed off the broom and passed it to Hooch, who smiled knowingly. "I told you that you should have let me go after him," she remarked. He waved that away and watched as Harry dove towards the ground, only to swoop back up again, graceful as a bird in flight. Sighing, he turned to Minerva. "We'll leave him for now, Albus. He can't be allowed to disrupt class like this," the professor groused. "I agree. As it was your class he missed, I expect that you have assigned him detention for his misbehavior." Turning away from the pitch, he walked towards the school, Minerva on his heels. Hoosh watched them leave, then turned back to the flying teenager. "I'm not sure what's going on with you, Potter, but you sure can fly, boy." That evening, after 2 headache potions and more lemon drops than were really good for him, the headmaster was seriously considering gouging out his own ears to shut out the shouting match his professors were currently engaged in. Oh, he could have used a silencing charm or other magical means to silence the din, but for some odd reason the violence appealed to him, even if it was self-directed. When he noticed mild-mannered Professor Spout suddenly draw her wand and point it at Professor Vector, he figured it was time to interfere. Lifting his own wand, he fired of a concussive blast that had everyone in the room clapping their hands to their ears and turning to glare at him. "That's better. Now, perhaps we could all return to our seats and discuss this like rational adults," he asked, more calmly than he thought possible. With much muttering, the professors did as he asked. Nodding in approval, he turned to Minerva. "Now what exactly is the problem, Potter?" she snapped. "He didn't show up to any of his classes today." Dumbledore sighed. "Have you assigned detentions?" We have. But Albus, there's something not right with the boy," she protested. "Potter's never been like this. While true, I think he will settle down," he said calmly, and wondered if they'd notice if he crossed his fingers. "Please remember, he lost his godfather not that long ago. I'm sure he'll come around with time." When the muttering started, he sighed. "Please, professors, if there's nothing else, we've all had a long day. Minerva, do let me know how Mr. Potter's detention goes." Nodding stiffly, she stood up. "You can be sure of that, Albus." Turning, she left the office, followed by the others. Albus winced when the door slammed closed. Pinching the bridge of his nose, he leaned back on his chair. Tomorrow would be better, he was sure. The next morning he was revising his opinion. He'd been awakened at the crack of dawn by Minerva, who seemed to take perverse delight in dragging him out of bed, all the while haranguing him in such a shrill voice he was sure his ears were bleeding. He stood in his bedchamber, dressed in his nightgown and cap, staring at her dumbly while she informed him that Potter had gone beyond the pale. He hadn't shown up for his detention, so she'd gone to the common room to find him. A third-year student informed her that he was in the library, so she'd gone to get him. Only when she got there, Ron Weasley informed her that she'd just missed him and that he was heading for the kitchen. From the kitchen, she was sent to Hagrid's, then the Great Hall, then the third-floor broom closet. You wouldn't believe who I found, nearly naked among the cleaning supplies. In the end, enraged, she went back to the common room, only to be informed that he was in his dorm room. Marching up the steps, she found him calmly reading a book and munching on a pastry, pacing furiously, nearly tearing out her hair. McGonagall suddenly whirled to face the headmaster, one eye twitching. "And you know what that boy had the gall to say to me? Do you?" she all but bellowed at him. "I'm not sure I want to know," Albus muttered. He said, "I'm sorry, Professor. I don't feel like serving detention tonight, or any other night, come to that." Taking a deep breath, she then glared at Dumbledore. When he didn't say anything, she threw up her hands. "Well, what do you intend to do about this?" Raising a hand to stroke his beard, he scowled. "Damn He missed his beard. I'll talk to him, Minerva. I should think so. This cannot be allowed to continue. With one final glare, she marched out of his bedchamber. A few seconds later, he heard his office door slam, and the day had only gotten worse. Potter hadn't shown up to class yet again. He'd been found by the lake, playing with a squid. Dumbledore hadn't been able to convince him to go to class, and, in the end, had floated him there himself. The students had laughed. Professor Flitwick had glared and muttered about the nerve of some students, and Albus had developed another headache. By lunch, it had become apparent that, while Albus could drag Harry to each of his classes, he couldn't make the boy perform. He sat in each class, staring straight ahead and humming to himself, retiring to his office to think he was interrupted by an enraged Professor Snape, who had developed a rather suspicious and very unfortunate stutter, but only with words that began with the letter P. "I cannot fix this," Snape snarled. "I've tried every spell I can think of, and nothing works. Do you have any idea how hard it is to talk about PPP potions when you can't even say the word? And forget about taking PP points. The damn hourglasses can't understand what I'm trying to say, so they ignore me." 2 hours, many books, and one visit to St. Mungo's later, Snape was left to fume and sputter. The stutter remained, and he was told he'd have to do his best. Snape tried to blame it on Potter, but as the boy wasn't in his class, Albus assured him, or tried to, that it wasn't possible. At dinner, Dumbledore stopped by the Gryffindor table and smiled at Harry and his friends. "Good evening, Mr. Potter. Miss Granger, Mr. Weasley." "Hello, Headmaster," Hermione said, smiling politely. "Hello, Professor," Ron muttered, his mouth full of food. "Hi," Harry said cheerfully. "Mr. Potter, would you please join me in my office after dinner?" "No, thank you, Headmaster." Ron began to cough, and Harry slapped him on the back a few times, all the while smiling at Dumbledore. "Sorry, Ron," wheezed. Food went down the wrong pipe. "Try not shoveling it in so fast," Hermione suggested sweetly. "I'm hungry," he complained. "It's not going to run away, Ron. Slow down and chew." As his friends continued their good-natured argument, Dumbledore leaned down to Harry. "I really must insist you join me in my office." "I'm sorry, sir, but I have other plans, and I really can't break them," Harry told him, his eyes shining with sincerity. "What is so important that you cannot spare an hour, Mr. Potter?" "Origami," he replied. "You'd be surprised how difficult it is." Dumbledore blinked. "It's very relaxing," Harry went on enthusiastically. "Earlier today in herbology, I nearly made a horse before it was shredded by a plant. Who knew some plants were attracted to paper? You would if you'd go to and pay attention in your classes," the headmaster snapped. Harry's eyes widened in mock disappointment. "Oh, and here we were having an enjoyable discussion, and you had to go and ruin it." His low lip quivered, and he looked at Dumbledore pleadingly. "Don't you love me any more? Mr. Potter, I've had enough of this foolishness." Drawing his wand, Albus levitated Harry from his seat and walked out of the great hall, the bobbing boy following behind him obediently. For once, Harry, seated in the air behind Dumbledore, smiled and waved at the students in the hall as they all laughed and pointed. When some of the Slytherin students cheered, he stuck his tongue out at them. Ron and Hermione watched Harry's unique exit from the great hall with interest. It was clear that their friend's actions had finally gotten the better of Dumbledore. If only the headmaster understood that the real war hadn't started yet. "I'm a little disappointed," Hermione said quietly. "To be honest, I thought the old man would last longer than this." Ron shrugged. "I'm not sure he's ever had a student openly defy him in front of the whole school before. In any case, Harry's enjoying himself, something that hasn't happened nearly often enough. It's interesting, really. Dumbledore denied Harry any type of real childhood, and now Harry's enjoying rubbing that in. Honestly, he's acting like a little kid, and it looks like loads of fun." Hermione laughed. "Don't worry, Ron. Our time is coming." Meanwhile, after a rather interesting trip to Dumbledore's office, Harry found himself seated in front of the headmaster's desk, staring into the disappointed eyes of a man he'd once respected, though he couldn't remember why. "So, are we going to stare at each other all night, or was there something you wanted?" Harry asked. "Honestly, I could be crafting paper animals right now." "Mr. Potter, Harry, we really must discuss this unfortunate anger problem you seem to have developed. Perhaps if we discovered the reasons behind your feelings, we could put an end to this nonsense." Harry shrugged. "It's simple, really. You are the problem. Short of you marching down to the Great Hall and announcing your retirement as headmaster of the school, I don't really see any way of resolving anything. Besides, I'm having way too much fun." Dumbledore sighed. "I know I didn't handle things as well as I should have after the incident at the Department of Mysteries," he began, then frowned when the boy's eyes turned cold. "Don't!" Harry hissed. "I don't care about your regrets, you bastard! I don't care about your regrets, you bastard! I have enough of my own without having to listen to yours." "What do you want me to say?" the headmaster asked. "Nothing. Nor do I want you to do anything," he replied coldly. "Let me explain what's going to happen this year, and every year that follows until you get the hell out of my life. I will do nothing you suggest, demand, or order. I will not willingly go to class. I will do no homework, nor will I serve detention. I will not walk out and face Voldemort. I simply see no need to do so." "You want him dead? Great! Kill him yourself." "But the prophecy," Dumbledore said, alarmed. "It's a load of crap, spewed out by a drunken old woman who should have been retired a long time ago." Harry shook his head. "Tell me something. Have you tried to kill Voldemort yourself?" Dumbledore blinked. The prophecy said. "Oh, for God's sake!" Harry interrupted. "Because of the prophecy, you've allowed that murdering bastard to kill countless people, while you sit, wringing your hands, waiting for me to grow up and kill him for you. You're as bad as he is. You sit back and watch the world burn, hoping some part of it remains when I'm strong enough to do something you should have done a long time ago. Hell, you might as well take the mark and join him officially. You've done nothing but help him on his rise to power. And you wonder why I'm mad. Fucking unbelievable." "Language, Mr. Potter!" Dumbledore snapped. Harry smiled. "Stuff it up your ass. Let me give you a little advice. Expel me from this school. You'll regret every second I remain here." "I have many regrets," Dumbledore said quietly. "You being here will not be one of them. I have dealt with rebellious students before, and all came to heel soon enough." "Came to heel? Am I a dog now? Shall I sit up and beg for treats?" Harry scoffed. "You've no idea what you're getting into. When I'm done with you, you'll be a broken shell of a man. You'll flinch and whimper any time someone mentions my name. Don't believe me? Ask yourself this, genius. According to the prophecy you believe so wholeheartedly in, I'm supposed to kill or be killed by Voldemort. You seem to think I can kill him. If that's true, how much trouble could it possibly be to break you?" Harry stood up and read the doubt on the headmaster's face. "Believe it," he said simply, then turned and walked from the office. When the door closed, Dumbledore leaned back on his chair. "That could have gone better," he mumbled. "September 3rd afternoon. Potions classroom, waiting for Professor Snape and the other students to arrive." Hermione leaned against the wall, glaring at Ron and tapping her foot. "You know, I'm all for punctuality, but this is a little ridiculous. Class isn't due to start for another 15 minutes. Why did we have to come so early?" "2 reasons," Ron said as he dug through his book bag. "Aha! I knew I'd put it in here." Standing, he held out his hand. "This is the first reason." Leaning forward, Hermione examined the object in the palm of his hand. It looked like a small rubber ball, yellow in color. "Do I want to know what that is?" "2 words. The twins," he told her, grinning. "Right? Don't want to know. They'll be heartbroken if they hear you say that." Looking down at the ball, he drew his wand and tapped it once. "Slytherins are such interesting people," he murmured. The ball began to glow, then shot off further into the dungeons. Hermione raised an eyebrow. "What did you just do?" Volunteered Slytherin to test one of Fred and George's products. "Ronald, it's not as bad as it sounds, Hermione. The twins have already tested it. This is actually more of a practice run to see if it's practical. They also said something about it helping to take care of our Slytherin problem during our operation at Hogwarts." He shook his head. "Operation! They've been watching too many Muggle war movies." "Muggle war movies? Alicia's fault. She has some sort of contraption that plays movies. Over the summer, she and Angelina had the twins over a lot and played movies for them. The girls paid for it, though. Fred and George wouldn't stop quoting things they heard in the movies they'd watched. The girls finally banned them from the house until they promised to never do it again." Hermione grinned. "Sometimes your brothers don't know when to stop." "Oh, they've learned. 2 weeks with no nookie settled them down." Seeing Hermione's expression, he held up both hands. "Hey, don't get on me for it. That's almost a direct quote from Fred. If you don't like it, talk to him about it. I'll pass, thanks." Thought you might, he smiled, then looked down the hall. She looked around. All right, so what's the second reason we came down early? Ron's eyes narrowed. Following his gaze, she frowned. Davis and Zabini. Yes, I want to talk to them for a moment, and this seemed like the best time. They're almost always the first ones here before class. Why them? Out of all the snakes in Slytherin, they're the smartest of the lot, though that isn't saying much. I thought I might be able to save us a bit of trouble later on. Hermione laughed. They're Slytherins. They live for trouble. Ron grinned. That's what I'm hoping for. I wouldn't believe it if I didn't see it. 2 Gryffindors early for class. What is the world coming to? Tracy Davis drawled. To be fair, it's not really a surprise to see Granger here early. But Weasley? Blaise Zabini shook his head. Odd indeed. Ron shrugged. Yeah, you've got me. To be honest, I wouldn't be here at all if I didn't need to take potions, and coming early, the mere thought of it makes my skin crawl. Unfortunately, it couldn't be avoided. We need to talk to you both. The 2 Slytherins stopped a few feet away and started at Ron as if he'd grown a second head. Talk to us. What on earth for? Davis asked. A lot of people say that if one's looking for a rational discussion from a Slytherin, talk to Davis or Zabini, Hermione said with a shrug. We thought we'd test that theory. Zabini's eyes narrowed. Rational discussion? About what? Slytherin's survival this year, Ron said. When Tracy's hand went for her wand, Hermione sighed and raised her own. She'd had it in her hand since the Slytherins appeared. It's much too late for that, Davis. Put it away and just listen. When Tracy held up her empty hands to show she was unarmed, Hermione nodded. Get on with it, Ron. The others will be arriving soon. She glanced down the hall at the large group of students making their way to class. All right, you two, this isn't really a discussion. It's actually a warning. Keep your ferret on a tight leash this year and don't mess with us. Keep your heads down and we'll leave you alone. Step out of line and you'll pay. Oh, please. You Gryffindors aren't exactly known for great planning, Weasel. Tracy laughed. Your house likes to rush in, then act all surprised when you get your asses handed to you. I must agree, Blaise replied. Ron laughed, and it's that type of thinking that's going to make this year so damn much fun. He looked at Davis and Zabini and grinned. Just do me a favor. When all hell breaks loose, remember this warning, Hermione put her wand away and smiled. I do believe we're done. Here, seeing the wariness in Davis and Zabini's eyes, Ron nodded. So it would seem we do thank you for your time. He turned away when Neville called his name. Tracy and Blaise looked at each other, unsure of what had just happened. Later that evening in the Gryffindor common room, the trio sat around a small table. Ron stretched and closed his book. Looking around, he nearly rolled his eyes when he noticed Hermione with her nose stuck in a book. She'd finished her assignments ages ago. Turning away from the bookworm, he grinned. Harry sat across the table from him, working in a new origami project which wasn't going well, judging by the muttered curses his friend was uttering. Problems? Ron asked him. Who knew swans were such perverse animals? Harry growled. Tossing down his project, he looked up at Ron. Done with your assignments? Yeah. Free for the evening at last. Good. I wanted to talk to you about your discussion with Zabini and Davis today. Been talking to Hermione, eh? I didn't know it was a secret, Hermione said as she marked her place and closed her book. It wasn't. Ron turned to Harry. So, what about it? One question. Why did you bother? Ron laughed. Simple. After being warned, they won't be able to help themselves. They'll have to try something. Which means you've already got something in mind, Harry said. Not me, but the twins. The orb, Hermione asked. Yeah, the twins wouldn't tell me what it does, just that it wouldn't really harm them. And they know this how? Harry asked. They tried it out several times on your house guest. Once they'd perfected it, they sent one to me. Harry grinned. This should be interesting. I agree, Ron replied. Hermione picked up her book and shook her head. Silly me. I keep hoping you two will grow up. This is more fun, Ron told her as he reached for his books. He stuffed them into his book bag and shoved the bag under the table. Sitting up, he glanced at Harry, then looked closer. All right, what's turning through that mind of yours, Potter? I've seen that look too many times. Harry asked as his eyes focused on Ron. Oh, it was nothing. Well, that's not true. Leaning forward, he smiled at Ron. Can the twins brew polyjuice? Fred and George, though they like to hide it, are brilliant, Harry, Hermione said. Some of the jokes they've come up with require some rather difficult brewing. Produce would be child's play to them. Ron shrugged. What did you have in mind? Harry grinned. Thanks to Creature, I have all that Dumbledore hair at the summer house, and I have this really interesting idea. I feel a headache coming on, Hermione muttered. At least this way you don't have to brew it, he told her. Besides, as long as he's not going to make me drink it, I am game. You would be, she sighed and looked at Harry. What's the idea? Do you still have a way of contacting Rita Skeeter? He asked. Her eyes widened. Oh, that's just evil. She looked between her two best friends, then burst out laughing. But oh, so perfect. She's in, Ron said, turning to Harry. So how do we work this? And who has to drink it? I'm not sure yet. Not us, though. I'm not sure any of us could keep a straight face long enough. True. Hey, what about Luna Lovegood? Hermione frowned. Why Luna? Ron shrugged. She's a bit odd herself. Plus, she doesn't like Skeeter. Not only does the woman work for her father's competitor, but she said some pretty nasty things about the Quibbler. Pulling a fast one on Rita might just tickle her funny bone. Do you think she'd do it? Harry asked. I'm not sure. I don't know her that well, but Ginny does. They spent a lot of time together this summer. We could ask her about Luna. When Harry and Hermione agreed, Ron got up and went to search for his sister. We need to make sure Luna understands that she doesn't have to do this, Harry said quietly. She's odd, yes, but she gets picked on a lot for it. I know, but keep in mind that Luna is brilliant in her own way. Granted, some of the things she comes up with drive me batty, but I think that's why she says them. She's looking for a reaction and finds it amusing when she gets one, Hermione said. What makes you say that? Watch her carefully when she says something off the wall. Her eyes. I don't know. It's like she's looking for something from you. She shrugged. I can't really explain it. Hey, Ginny said as she slid into the chair Ron had been using. Her brother stood behind her. You wanted to talk to me about something. Harry told her what they were planning and asked her about Luna. Once Ginny had stopped laughing, she nodded her head. Oh, I'm sure Luna would love the idea. She hates Rita. I'll ask her to come to the common room tomorrow evening if you want. You can talk to her about it yourselves. Good idea, Ginny? Thanks, Harry said. Grabbing a sheet of paper from a stack he'd been using for origami, he reached for Ron's quill and ink bottle. Let's see what your brothers have to say about brewing us some polyjuice. Hedwig will be glad to have something to do. Hedwig delivered Fred and George's reply the next day at lunch. The twins are on board, Harry told Ron, Hermione, and Ginny. They say it will take a few days to get the ingredients and even longer to brew the potion, but they said it's easy to make. Easy, Hermione grumbled. Ron laughed. For them, yes. But they never tried to brew it when they were in second year. True, she said, somewhat mollified. Have you spoken to Luna? Harry asked Ginny. I did. She's coming to the common room after dinner tonight. Assuming she agrees, when do you want to do this? Ron asked. The potion's going to take a month to brew, Hermione reminded them. When is the first Hogsmeade weekend? Harry asked. Middle of November or so, Ginny told him. Harry looked at his three friends, then shrugged. That solves the problem of when and where. Hermione, when the time comes to contact Rita, suggest meeting in a private room at the Three Broomsticks on the first Hogsmeade weekend. Grimmauld Place, September 8th. Fuck! Bump! Fuck! Fuck! Bump! Fuck! No fair, shouted George as he chased after the ball. Creature sat at the net line and held up a card with a large 9 printed on it. Then he pointed to Fred. Damn it, Fred, moaned George. Hey, don't blame me. I didn't make the rules for this tennis thing, Fred retorted with a grin. How's the ball holding up? George walked over the ball and cancelled the silencing charm. I am Lord Lumpypants. Ha! Beat me. I can't be beat. Nah, you will bow and scrape your testicles in fear, shouted the dark torso. George bent over and with one hand lifted him up and bounced him a few times. The elasticity seems to be holding up just fine, but I think our test subject has slipped a few notches below normal. Fred ran up the court and vaulted over the net. Landing next to George, he poked the dark torso a few times. Don't touch me, you red-headed demon. Bow and grovel before the greatest Lumpypants in the world. He then began to growl menacingly. Fred turned to George. Are you sure it isn't the potion doing this? I mean, he's growling. George shook his head. It! He was growling before I even gave him the potion. He paused and looked thoughtfully at Creature. Oi! Bugnuts! What do you do with his nibs here when we're not using him? He shouted. Fred blinked and looked at George. You don't think? I do. I mean, Mum always said we'd drive her spare, but the dark torso is clearly around the bend. "We're good, but not that good," replied George. Creature walked over to the pair, his eyes alight with glee as Fred calmly bounced the sputtering Dark Lord like a handball. "You bellowed for Creature. You poor excuses for wizards," sneered Creature. "Man, Harry's got to put this one down," muttered Fred. "He's creepier than Snape, and Dobby is any better. That one is so into Harry, it's scary. The other day I saw the little blighter planning Harry's harem." "He was even compiling a list of girls," replied George. "Well, I've wanted a harem. Who wouldn't, really?" "Yeah, but included with Dobby's were nude photos he'd personally taken." "Evil Dobby!" spat Creature. "Must stop him somehow, or the master will pick him." "I know. Creature will show the master joys of elf sex." Everyone, even the Dark Torso, paused and turned to look at Creature incredulously. Fred shook his head and looked at Creature with narrowed eyes. "What have you been doing to the Dark Torso when we're not using him?" Creature looked down and mumbled something unintelligible. "What was that?" asked George. Creature looked up at the pair defiantly. "Dobby and me sing to him." Fred turned to his brother. "I can't see anything wrong with that, mate." George nodded doubtfully, then turned his attention back to Creature. "What kind of songs do you sing?" Creature broke into a wide and very evil grin. "It's a world of wonder, a world of fun," he bellowed. "No, not a small world," moaned the Dark Torso. He shook violently for a second, then began to twitch spasmodically. Once the spasms subsided, he looked up at the twins, a beatific smile upon his face. "It's a world of wonder, a world of—" 10 minutes later, Fred and George huddled in the kitchen, wide-eyed and trembling. "Stop humming!" shouted Fred. "I can't help it," moaned George. "Obliviate me before it eats my brain." He then glared when he noticed his brother humming. "Ah!" "Stop it." Dobby popped into the kitchen and looked at the twins with suspicious eyes. "Creature is cheating again," he muttered. "I need to get Harry Potter his harem before Creature cheats me out of my position. September 10th, Hogwarts grounds." They sat in groups, studying and talking together, enjoying the sunshine while it lasted. Hermione, Neville, Harry, and Ron decided to head for the lake. Hagrid was down on the shore, trying to convince a gaggle of first years that the squid really was harmless. Their dunking in the lake on the night of their arrival still had many of the youngsters wary of the giant cephalopod. They waved to Ginny, Luna, and a group of their friends as they passed them by. Their meeting with Luna in the Gryffindor common room had been amusing, and the girl had been more than happy to help them. "Out for a stroll with your boyfriends, Mudblood," a voice drawled. Hermione rolled her eyes. "Why, you jealous Draco, pining for a boyfriend to call your own." Turning, she faced the blonde and his ever-present sidekicks and nearly laughed when he blanched. "What? Did I strike a nerve? I always thought he was gay." Ginny called from her spot with her friends. "That would explain why he's always so interested in his hair," Luna remarked. "And why Crabber and Goyle are always with him. Thank you for that painful and disturbing mental image, Luna." "You're welcome," she quipped as she and many other students stood up and made their way closer to Harry and his friends. Draco's eyes narrowed. "If my father heard you say that, what is it with you?" Ron asked him. "Can't you do anything without your father backing you up? Hell, Draco, you're nothing but a coward. You hide behind Crabbe and Goyle and threaten people with your Death Eater father, who, on the off chance you've forgotten, got his ass kicked by a group of fifth-year students," Hermione added. "So tell us, why should we be afraid of someone who can't even beat a group of kids? You've got nothing to brag about, Granger. If I remember correctly, you nearly got yourself sliced in half," Draco taunted. "Ah, yes, Dolohov. A shame about that," Ron said, his eyes gleaming. "His untimely death delayed dinner, our first night back at school." "You've got to wonder what was going through his mind when he killed himself," Harry said. "The train, I would imagine," Hermione replied. "Oh, I love it when she gets literal," Neville said, laughing. Harry shook his head. "No, I think he finally realized the truth as he sat in his cell in Azkaban. He may have cut Hermione, but she was healed and walked free. Poor Antonin just couldn't live with the knowledge that a mudblood had beaten him. He cocked his head at Draco. But then you'd understand all about that, wouldn't you, Malfoy? Tell me, Was Hermione's right hook as painful as it looked when she smashed in your arrogant face and knocked you on your ass when the other students began to laugh? Draco saw red and drew his wand. He never knew what hit him. Neville later estimated that Draco had been hit with 6 stunning spells, 2 jelly-leg jinxes, an impediment curse, 3 incarcerous spells, and 1 new and improved bat bogey hex, which caused much gagging and glares sent Ginny's direction. Hermione stared down at the unconscious Draco, then looked at Crabber and Goyle. "You know, if you asked Ginny nicely, I'm sure she'd cast the bat bogey hex on you both. It would save you the trouble of having to mind for them yourselves." "For Merlin's sake, Hermione, that's just disgusting," Ginny protested. Hermione pointed at Draco. "And that isn't. Seriously, the old hex wasn't good enough. You had to improve it. I have to improve it. I have to ask, did you make the bogies bigger as to be more painful, or just to gross out your friends?" Both, really," Ginny admitted. Neville looked between Crabber and Goyle. "So, are you going to draw your wands, or drag the ferret to the infirmary?" The 2 young men looked at each other for a moment, then Goyle shrugged. Bending, he picked up Draco and tossed him over his shoulder with a grunt. Crabber glared at them for a moment. When he opened his mouth to speak, several people leaned closer to listen. "When Draco's daddy hears what you've done," he said in a high-pitched, rather feminine voice, "you'll pay." "Wait, did you just say daddy?" Harry asked. "And what the hell is wrong with your voice? Sounds like someone squeezing his balls," Dean said, staring at Crabber. Ron shook his head, and that explains why Crabber never speaks. He looked at Malfoy's minion. "With that voice, how does anyone take you seriously?" When Crabber began to speak, Goyle grunted at him, then nodded toward the castle. With one last fuming look at the other students, Crabbe turned and walked away, Goyle following a few steps behind. "Well, that was fun," Neville said, to no one in particular. "Oh, the fun's just starting," Harry said, smiling. "Do I want to know?" Neville asked. "Remind Ron to tell you about his warning to the Slytherins." "You'll understand then." "The boy just doesn't learn." A voice rumbled behind them. Harry sighed and turned around. "Hello, Hagrid." Hagrid's gaze went from the retreating Slytherins to Harry. "Yeah, never drew your wand, but yeah," goaded him into the fight. Hermione shook her head. "And calling me a mudblood wasn't Malfoy's attempt to start something. Hagrid, he's been calling you ever since he was first years, and that makes it right," Ron asked. "Wait," Neville cut in. "Let me see if I understand this. Hermione's supposed to ignore insults, but it's all right for Malfoy not to. Is this really what you're saying, Hagrid?" The first years gathered around the half-giant looked up at him, their eyes questioning. Hagrid looked down. "Of course not. She should have just reported it to Dumbledore. I have," Hermione told him, "for 5 years now. You'll forgive me if I've grown tired of the headmaster's lack of action against the son of a Death Eater." Hagrid's head came up. "Now, Hermione," he began. "Leave it, Hagrid. There's nothing you can say that will excuse Dumbledore's lack of action on this and many other issues," Harry said firmly. "Malfoy had the choice to walk away. He chose not to and finally paid for his actions. I wouldn't expect anything less from Dumbledore's man," he said quietly. His tone made the title sound like an insult, and it wasn't lost on Hagrid, whose shoulders slumped. "Perhaps I made a mistake in second year, helping to get you released from Azkaban." The hurt mirrored in Hagrid's eyes was clear. "All right, yeah, lot," he said, turning away from Harry to address the first years gathered around him. "Lesson's over for the day." The expected summons to Dumbledore's office came later that day. It was ignored, of course, which forced the headmaster to hunt for the young man once more. Finally, finding him in the Hogwarts kitchens, he floated Harry up to his office. Once they were both seated, the headmaster leaned back on his chair and sighed. "Would you care to explain why Draco Malfoy is in the infirmary, recovering from spell damage?" Harry reached over to Dumbledore's dish of lemon drops and popped one in his mouth. Dumbledore pinched the bridge of his nose. "Why?" Harry shrugged. "I don't know. You'd have to ask whoever cast on him. Crabbe and Goyle informed me that you started the confrontation." Harry blinked wide green eyes. They spoke in complete sentences. "Well, hell, it looks like the propaganda the minister's been spewing about this school is correct. The staff really can teach 2 apes to talk." "Good job, headmaster." Dumbledore leaned forward. "Please answer the question." "What question? Did you start the confrontation with Mr. Malfoy?" Which one? I mean, I did free the Death Eater's house elf back in second year, Harry said, cocking his head slightly. He wasn't real happy with me. With Draco Malfoy, Dumbledore growled. No, no, no! Draco wasn't there when I freed Dobby, he corrected. It was the Death Eater Malfoy. He paused for a moment. Although, now that I think about it, that isn't the distinction it used to be, since Draco's a Death Eater now, Mr. Potter, the headmaster warned. What? You didn't know? Harry asked, feigning shock. There's actually something that goes on this school that the great Albus Dumbledore isn't aware of. My God, what's next? Talking apes! Oh, wait! We covered that, didn't we? When Dumbledore simply started at him, Harry rose to his feet. Well, this has been fun, but you did interrupt my meal down in the kitchens. Turning, he made his way to the door. Mr. Potter, you will serve detention tonight for purposely goading Mr. Malfoy, the headmaster informed him. Harry laughed. I'll consider that, Professor, just as soon as I see Mr. Malfoy on his knees in the Great Hall at dinner, begging for Hermione Granger's forgiveness for 5 years' worth of bigotry. Reaching the door, he pulled it open, then looked back at Dumbledore. Of course, you'll have to be on your knees beside him for not putting a stop to it when it first started. With a wave, Harry left the office, closing the door quietly behind him. Yanking his glasses off, Dumbledore tossed them down on his desk so violently the lenses broke. September 11th morning, Potions classroom. Snape paced the front of the room, glancing at the door from time to time. The Gryffindor students sat quietly, though confused, waiting for class to begin. Snape stopped in front of his desk and looked at the clock. Frowning, he turned to the class. Open your books to chapter 2 and begin reading. I will return in a moment. No one is to leave their desks. If I find anyone out of their assigned seat when I return, you will receive a failing grade for the day and detention with Filch this evening. Glaring around the room until the students had opened their books, he then spun towards the door and marched out. Where are the Slytherins? Neville asked Hermione quietly. No idea, she said, but I'm sure we'll find out soon enough. Ron rose from his seat and quickly made his way to Snape's desk. Putting out his wand, he pointed at the professor's chair and murmured quietly. When he turned to go back to his seat, he grinned at his fellow housemates and put a finger to his lips. Not a word now. Seamus grinned. What did you do? Ron shrugged as he slid back into his chair. Eastern Sandfleas, he said, courtesy of my brother, Bill. It's a favorite prank among Egyptian curse-breakers. Parvati looked at Ron, her eyes wide. But they can't be removed by magic. They have to be picked out of the hair, one by one. I know, Ron said as he pulled his potion book closer. And you placed them on his chair. Dean asked. That means they'll have to be picked out of his. He stopped, then gagged at where his thoughts were taking him. My God, Ron, Lavender gasped. That's just brilliant! The Gryffindors began to laugh. Snape marched in 10 minutes later to find his students quietly reading as he'd told them to. Class dismissed, he barked. Everyone get out! The students gathered their belongings and bolted from the room. It's not that I don't mind having a free period, but what the hell's going on? Ron asked as they walked up the stairs. Hermione shook her head. I don't know. She chewed her lip in thought. Where's Harry? Neville shrugged. Assuming the headmaster found him, he should be in household magic. So, library or Great Hall? Ron asked. Great Hall, Hermione said promptly, unless either of you needs to study. When both boys looked at her strangely, she stopped and scowled at them. What? I don't have any assignments. I'm ahead on my reading, and I don't feel like putting up with Madame Pince's glaring this early in the day, she growled. I hate it when people throw off my schedule. Neville patted her shoulder comfortingly. It's all right, Hermione. You can tell the mean, nasty Slytherins all about it once they've been found. Piss off, Neville. Language, Miss Granger. Ron quit. When she glared at him, he shuddered back in mock horror. Right. Never mind. The Great Hall it is, he said, turning to lead the way. By lunch, the Gryffindors were giving Hermione a wide berth. When Harry entered the Great Hall, he frowned, seeing that no one was sitting near her. Deciding that caution was the better part of valor, he slid in next to Ron and nodded toward Hermione. What's that all about? All of her morning classes have been cancelled. Our poor little bookworm is suffering educational withdrawals, he murmured. Cancelled? Why? What have I missed? Ron turned in his seat and looked at the Slytherin table. You haven't noticed? Turning to look, Harry frowned at the empty table. Where are they? No one knows. They didn't show up for potion class this morning or any other class, as far as I can tell. The whole house? All years? Harry asked, surprised. Yep. I've had 3 classes cancelled this morning. I don't really mind the free time, but it's just odd. And it's not just that, he added, as he pointed to the head table. When was the last time we had a meal in here without a professor present? Looking at the head table, Harry shook his head. That might explain why Dumbledore's been late in finding me today. And he hasn't been very gentle when he takes me to class, either. He's been practically flinging me at my desk before rushing off. Turning back to Hermione, he frowned at the dark look on his friend's face. He loved her dearly, but if this kept up for much longer, they'd all pay the price. Thinking quickly, he hit on an idea and whispered Dobby's name. When the elf appeared, Harry turned slightly and murmured quietly to him for a moment. When Dobby nodded and disappeared, he turned back to the table and began to fill his plate. When he heard the small pop of Dobby's return, he glanced at Hermione. The elf had placed a book bag in front of her and smiled. When she said something to him, Dobby shrugged, bowed, then popped away. Opening the bag, Hermione pulled out 2 old and dusty books. Brushing them off lightly, her eyes widened and she looked at Harry. Picking up his glass, he lifted in salute and winked. Laughing, she shook her head at him, then looked down and opened the first book. Nicely done, Ron murmured. I wasn't looking forward to spending time in the common room tonight. Harry looked around at the rest of his housemates, most of whom were grinning at him. Shrugging, he reached for his fork. It's easier this way. We'd have only pissed her off more once she realized we were all hiding from her. By dinner that evening, the school was abuzz with rumors. No one had seen a single Slytherin all day, and all classes had been cancelled after lunch. Filing into the great hall and seeing the headmaster standing alone. At the head table, the students rushed to their seats. Once the hall had quieted, Dumbledore cleared his throat. As I'm sure you are all aware, there was some trouble in Slytherin House. Professor Snape discovered this morning that the students had all come down with a mysterious illness. It was serious enough to overtax the school's ability to handle, and they have all been transferred to St. Mungo's for care. As a result, we do not yet know what has caused the illness, or if it is contagious. As such, any student who begins to feel ill should report to Madame Pomfrey immediately. Symptoms include dizziness, blurred vision, head and stomach pains, vomiting, diarrhea, euphoria, and the repeated singing of the Hogwarts school song. An owl winged into the hall, and all eyes turned to watch the bird's flight. It landed in front of Ron Weasley, and he reached out to remove its burden, clearing his throat to regain the student's attention. Dumbledore rubbed his hand over his bald head. The staff is exhausted after dealing with the care and transfer of the sick, and I have given them tomorrow off to rest. Classes will resume the day after tomorrow. Until then, all students are restricted to their common rooms, the library and the great hall, which will be used for meals only. Soon as you have finished dinner, you are excused for the evening. Stepping back, the headmaster gazed around the great hall one more time, then shuffled towards the door. I hope it's not contagious, Ginny said as the headmaster stepped out of the hall. It's not, Ron replied as he looked up from the folded parchment in his hand. How do you know? Hermione asked. The twins, he told her. At her puzzled expression, he squirmed in his seat. Remember the orb? Hermione's eyes widened and Harry began to laugh. What orb? Ginny asked. What are you talking about? Something our brothers came up with? He said, looking at her. This doesn't sound good, Neville commented. Well, not for Slytherin, at any rate, Ginny said. So, what did they do? She asked Ron. After explaining the orb to Ginny and Neville, he shrugged. Following the instructions they gave me, I activated the orb last night, just before I went to sleep, and it made them sick. All of them? Hermione asked, a bit shocked at the scale of the twins' creation. That's not all it did, he muttered, then held the parchment out to her. Taking it, she unfolded the note and her jaw dropped. Oh, my, she finally murmured, letting the note fall to the table. In her hand were a stack of photos. How did they manage this? She flipped through the snapshots, then passed them to Harry. Taking them, Harry burst out laughing. The first picture showed Malfoy, Zabini, and Parkinson. Draco and Blaise had their arms wrapped around each other and looked to be singing passionately to each other. Pansy was clutching her stomach as she puked on them both. None of them seemed to be terribly upset over the fact that they were covered in vomit. The rest of the photos were similar, only with different people. The last photo was a wide shot of the common room. The floor, furnishings, and even the walls seemed to be covered in bile. Passing the photos to Ginny, Harry then reached for the parchment Hermione had dropped. "Well, according to this," he said a few moments later, once activated, "the orb was spelled to discharge a vapor into the Slytherin common room. 2 hours later, it started taking pictures." He shook his head. They apologized, saying that they could only get it to take 15 shots. They then used Dobby to retrieve the orb. They developed the images today and sent them to Ron. He looked up at Hermione. "This is way beyond me. How did they manage to do all this with one little orb?" "You're asking me," she blurted. She turned to Ron and scowled. "They tanked their owls on purpose." "Don't scowl at me," he shot back. "I had nothing to do with their owls." Muttering darkly about having a long chat with the twins someday, she ignored the laughter at the Gryffindor table as the pictures were passed around. Morning, September 13th. Snape stood quietly at the front of the room as the Gryffindors found their seat. Once the class had settled, he looked down his long nose and stared at them for a moment. "As half of our class is still absent, we will not be brewing PP potions until their return. As such, you are to continue reading Chapter 2. I would expect a report on what little information you dunderheads managed to retain from your reading by next Wednesday. Well, open your books and begin." Once they'd pulled out their books, he made his way to his desk and sat down. Putting last week's homework assignments from a drawer, he began his marking. Ron glanced up now and then to watch the professor. When the man began to squirm in his chair, he bit his lip and looked back down at his book. He wasn't the only one who was watching the professor. Eyes flicked back and forth between books and the professor often as the class wore on. When they were dismissed some time later, most were disappointed. The professor had shifted a bit in his chair now and then, but that was all. Walking from the class, Ron frowned in thought, trying to remember everything his brother told him about the spell he'd used. In the end, he could only conclude that he'd messed up his casting. At lunch, Harry and Hermione tried to console him. "I'm sure if you write Bill, he could tell you where you went wrong," Hermione said. "It can't be an easy spell. Eastern sand fleas aren't native to Britain after all." "Don't worry about it, mate," Harry added. "He's still stuttering, isn't he?" He looked up at the head table, his eyes finding Snape. The staff had returned to eating in the Great Hall yesterday at dinner. "Yeah," Ron said, somewhat cheered by that fact, as his eyes followed Harry's. Snape shifted on his chair several times throughout the meal. He and McGonagall spoke in low tones several times, and the deputy headmistress's expression became more pinched as the meal went on. As the students finished lunch and began to gather their belongings, McGonagall's patience finally ended. "For Merlin's sake, Severus, be still!" she snapped loudly. "I can't!" Snape cried, leaping to his feet. He hauled his robe up to his armpits and dug at the waistband of his pants. "It itches!" Obviously distraught, the man dropped his pants to his ankles, and his hands dove into his undergarments to scratch vigorously at his genitals. "Oh, Merlin, it itches!" Severus, Minerva shrieked. "Remember where you are!" Dropping into his chair, the man stretched out his legs and continued to scratch himself. "The itch. It burns." Snape looked around and blanched. The professors were on their feet, staring at him in horror, while the students were pointing at him and laughing uproariously. When the light of a camera's flash went off, Snape leapt to his feet, removed his hands from his underwear, and slammed his palms on them. "Table! Give me that camera, you little—" "Oh, shit!" He turned away suddenly and began to scratch himself again. "Merlin, make it stop! All students are to report to their classes!" Dumbledore yelled over the laughter. "Now!" he finally bellowed when no one moved. Once the hall was clear, he turned to Snape. He snapped. "He was squirming all through lunch," Minerva said, scowling down at the man in question. "Severus," Dumbledore asked, "do you have an explanation for this?" The man was too distraught to answer. He continued to scratch and mumble to himself. Sighing, Dumbledore reached up to stroke his beard. When his hand touched the smooth skin of his chin, he scowled. "Damn it! I miss my beard!" "Let's get him to the infirmary, Minerva," he ordered. "Maybe Poppy can figure this out." 20 minutes later, Poppy stepped out from behind the curtain she'd drawn around Snape's bed and approached Albus and Minerva. Eastern sand fleas, she reported, shaking her head in disgust. And with all the scratching he's been doing, the skin is broke open and raw. Albus winced. That means a soak-in. He shuddered. That's right, a 2-hour soak in oatmeal and wintergreen oil, Poppy confirmed. Why does he need to soak in that? Minerva asked. Eastern sand fleas are nearly impossible to spot, the Mediwitch told her. They're very small to begin with, and they act almost like chameleons, in that they match the skin tone of their host. The soak is necessary. The oatmeal smothers them, while the wintergreen oil counteracts their chameleon abilities, making them visible so they can be plucked out. Why can't you just remove them with magic? McGonagall asked. Dumbledore shook his head. They're immune to magic. It's actually rather fascinating. Severus would beg to differ, Poppy said tartly. Minerva looked toward the curtained-off area, then back to the Mediwitch. But wintergreen oil in that particular area, won't that be painful? It's going to burn like dragon fire, she stated, and burn creams don't work on that kind of pain. You do realize I'm going to have to pluck him bald, don't you? What? Minerva gasped. Why? Eastern sand fleas are black, the same color as Severus's hair. To ensure I've gotten those not attached to the skin. The hair has to go. She turned to Dumbledore and raised an eyebrow. I understand, but it must be done, he told her. Poppy threw her hands in the air. You don't pay me enough for this. Can't you send him to St. Mungo's? I think it would be better to keep this as quiet as possible, don't you? Severus would be embarrassed enough by this, he told her sternly. Give her a raise, Albus! An anguished voice called from behind the curtain. I don't need an angry witch between my legs, you rotten bastard! Dumbledore flinched but didn't speak. Poppy's expression darkened. Fine, she snapped. But you owe me, Albus! You owe me big! Spinning on her heel, she marched to the infirmary's bathroom to prepare the soak. I think that's our cue to leave, Dumbledore said. Turning, he walked quickly to the doors. Minerva watched him retreat, then looked back at the door Poppy had disappeared through. Not a bad idea, she muttered. Poppy's going to be angry for days after this. Great Hall, September 18th breakfast. Ron slid into a spot next to Harry at the Gryffindor table, a scowl on his face. I see the Slytherins are back with us. Rumor has it they were brought back to the school 2 days ago. I guess they figure it's safe to release the snakes into the general population, Harry said as he reached for a platter of eggs. They still look a bit green, though. They do match their house colors nicely, Seamus said with a laugh. And their head of house is still wincing when he walks, Parvati pointed out. Ron grinned. Remind me to thank Bill for that. And I think we should all thank Colin, Hermione added as she buttered a piece of toast. I was one of the first down to breakfast this morning. It would seem our little Colin is growing up into a polite young man. He gave each Slytherin a present to welcome them back. What was it? Lavender asked. A wonderful picture of their head of house digging at his genitals, she replied, before taking a bite. Laughter rang out at the Gryffindor table, causing many heads to turn their way. Think they know we were involved? Harry asked a few moments later. That lot. Of course they do, Harry, Hermione told him. Even if we weren't, they'd still blame us. I wonder how long it will take them to try to strike back, Dean mused. Oh, I don't think they'll have much time for that, Lavender told him, pouring herself a second cup of tea. Harry stared at her for a moment, then looked around. Most of the Gryffindor girls were grinning. All right, what have you lot done? Us, Ginny asked, her eyes twinkling. Why would you think we've done anything? Because he knows us. The girls began to laugh. It wasn't a pleasant sound. Just then a shriek came from the Slytherin table, and people began turning and standing up to see what the commotion was all about. Millicent Bulstrode shrieked again, jumped to her feet, and began yanking on her robe. The robe appeared to be shrinking in width, though not in length. It wasn't long before the girl resembled a rather lumpy sausage. Finally, able to get hold of the wayward garment, Millicent ripped it from her body. Reaching out, she grabbed the table to steady herself and began to pant. The Slytherin girls moved toward her, concerned, while the boys began to snicker. Everyone froze when she began to shriek once more. Merlin, I hate being short, Ginny muttered, unable to see over or around all the people standing to watch the spectacle. In frustration, she finally climbed up on the bench to get a clear view, when Millicent began to grab at her clothing. Many people groaned. No one wanted to see her without clothes on. Their wants didn't enter into the girl's mind, however, as she ripped the constricting garments from her body and stood buck-ass naked in front of her schoolmates and the staff. Moving quickly, her friends did their best to shield her nakedness from prying eyes, while her male housemates began to make lewd comments about Millicent's hidden attributes. "Neville blanched! Well, there's no accounting for taste, I suppose," he muttered. "Merlin, I'm never going to get that image out of my mind." He shuddered and turned away. "I wouldn't just yet," Hermione murmured to him quietly. He looked at her oddly, ready to ask what she meant when several more shrieks bounced off the stones of the great hall. "I'm going to be deaf soon if they keep doing that," Ron groused. "Now, what's the problem?" Snape had started moving towards the Slytherin table, but had stopped to gape when, one by one, the girls in his house began to pull and yank on their robes. "A little PP privacy, if you don't mind, Headmaster," Snape bellowed as he moved quickly towards the Slytherin table. "What?" Dumbledore asked, bemused, as he watched the girls begin to rip their clothing off. "Albus!" Minerva snapped. Receiving no reply, she cast a sonorous charm on herself and stood on her chair. "All students are to leave the hall immediately. Get to class, all of you!" The students began to gather their belongings and move towards the exit, many walking backward so as to watch the now naked, weeping girls as Snape tried to shield them from prying eyes. The Slytherin boys, it was noted by many, were the last to leave. Their gawking, laughing, and lewd comments actually caused Snape to issue a mass detention for every male in his house. Once the students had left, Minerva whirled to face Albus. "You randy old goat, you will stop staring at those poor girls this instant." "I was just curious, Minerva," he mumbled. "An intriguing spell, isn't it? Leave, Albus," she thundered. "As you're obviously no help, get out." Shaking his head as though trying to clear his mind, Dumbledore looked down at her. "You don't honestly think I was ogling the poor dears, do you?" His eyes twinkled, though his expression was one of hurt. "You're a pervert, Albus. Now do as I said. Severus and I will tend to this." Sighing, he turned away. "No one understand me," he murmured. At lunch, many of the girls from other houses had converged on their Slytherin counterparts, offering sympathy. They also planted the seeds of distrust and dissent. Standing near the doors to the hall, Hannah Abbott, a prefect in Hufflepuff, patted Daphne Greengrass on the shoulder and shook her head. "For what it's worth, the girls of Hufflepuff tore into our male housemates last night. We're pretty sure they didn't have anything to do with the prank, but their behavior was appalling," she said scathingly. "House rivalries aside, common decency should have sent them out of the hall as soon as they realized what was happening." "I have to agree," Lisa Turpin said as she joined them. "And I can assure you that no boy in Ravenclaw had anything to do with this. Much like our Hufflepuff sisters, we made sure of that. That just leaves Gryffindor." Daphne spat. "Well, it's just something we heard," Lisa said hesitantly. "What have you heard?" Millicent asked as she pushed her way into the group. "Give me a moment, Millicent," Susan said as she stood on her toes and looked around. Spotting who she was looking for, she waved. "It might best if you heard it for yourselves." A few moments later, Eleanor Brownstone and Laura Madley, two third-year Hufflepuffs, joined them, looking a bit nervous to be among so many upperclassmen. Susan smiled reassuringly at the younger girls. "Would you tell Daphne and Millicent what you heard this morning?" Laura's eyes widened, and she looked ready to bolt. "It's all right," Lisa said, trying to calm her. "Just tell them exactly what you heard. Despite what the Gryffindors would have you believe, the Slytherins are not monsters. Just to be honest." Eleanor glanced at Laura, who still looked scared, and took a step forward. "Laura and I were some of the last to leave the hall this morning. Someone had kicked her bag over on their way out, and it took us a bit to gather her stuff. When we left, we walked past a group of boys, and they were talking about what had just happened in the Great Hall. They were laughing about it, and several of them were begging two of the others to teach them the spell they used on you. One boasted he was going to use it on his girlfriend the next time she got above herself." Frowning, Eleanor looked at Susan. "What does that mean, anyway?" Susan smiled. "I'll explain it to you later." Millicent's face resembled a thunderstorm. "And who were these boys you saw?" "I don't know their names," Eleanor said. "Could you point them out?" Daphne asked quietly. "We could try," Laura said. Turning, she looked towards the Slytherin table and starting pointing out the boys she'd seen. "Eleanor confirmed her choices." "Thank you both for your help," Lisa said. You should both get back to the table before lunch is over, Susan added, nodding. The third years turned and walked away. Susan looked at Daphne and Millicent. The girls told this to me between classes. I've never known them to lie, but I'm not sure if the boys in your house are capable of doing something like this. Slytherin doesn't mean stupid. Millicent snapped. Lisa sighed. I don't think that's what she meant. Look, I don't know how things work in your house, and I'm not asking to know, but the guys in Ravenclaw would never think of pranking the girls in their own house. They'd know we'd find out it was them, nor would they do something this cruel and mean-spirited to their own housemates. Susan shrugged. In any case, you now know what we know. Use the information as you see fit. I'm going to get lunch before class starts. She walked towards the Hufflepuff table and waved at Hannah, who was saving her a seat. Nodding to the two Slytherins, Lisa turned toward her own house table and walked away. What do you think, Duff? Millicent asked as she watched the two girls rejoin their friends. I'm not sure, but something Eleanor said keeps going through my mind. What's that? Daphne looked at her and cocked her head. How many times have we heard Draco tell Pansy that she was getting above herself? Millicent's eyes narrowed, and she looked at the boys seated at their table. Harper, Vasey, Urquhart, Malfoy, Crabber, Goyle, and Mott. Turpin was right about something else as well, Daphne added. This little prank was cruel and mean-spirited. It also took planning. Let's face facts, Millie. The Gryffindors are more likely to change our hair color or hit us with stink bombs at the spur of the moment. They seem unable to plan anything. They just act on impulse. That's why they always get trounced so badly. She looked at the boys sitting at the table. No, this took planning to pull off. No Gryffindor is capable of something like this. We can't let them get away with it, Daphne, Millicent growled. Nor will we. Come on, let's go talk to the other girls. The next morning, not a single Slytherin boy showed up for breakfast. The fact was not lost on their head of house. Standing, he approached the table and spoke with Pansy for a moment before leaving the hall. Wonder what's going on there, Dean said as he watched Snape leave. You were right, Hermione said to Parvati, who sat across from her. Lisa and Susan got it done. She slid a galleon across the table. Parvati scooped up the coin and grinned. Now we just have to wait to find out what happened. Ron looked between the two, then turned to Harry. Am I the only one lost here? Harry shook his head. No, I would say everyone not of the female gender is as lost as you are. But don't worry. The girls will tell us when they're ready. My, aren't you blazed this morning? Siamus remarked. I thought you and Ron would be demanding answers from them. Do we look stupid to you? Ron asked. Anger that lot if you want. I like my head where it's at. Dean laughed. I think he was hoping you'd walk into the line of fire so he didn't have to. Something like that, Seamus muttered. Look, Ginny said quietly, pointing at the entrance to the hall. Snape had returned and was rushing towards the head table. Once there, he leaned down and spoke with Dumbledore for a moment. The headmaster stood abruptly and said something to McGonagall and Flitwick. Merlin, I hope the Slytherins aren't puking again, Neville said. As Snape, Dumbledore, and McGonagall left the hall, Flitwick stood on his chair. With the help of a sonorous charm, he announced that classes were cancelled for the day. He flicked his wand to cut the spell, then climbed down from his chair and gathered the other teachers. A moment later, they all moved towards the doors. Hermione's eyes narrowed as she watched Daphne Greengrass stand up and walk to the Ravenclaw table. She stopped next to Lisa Turpin and spoke with her for a few moments before returning to her seat. Lisa's expression was blank, but her eyes were wide with shock. Standing, she walked quickly to the Hufflepuff table, where she spoke quietly with Susan Bone. When she was done, she returned to her own table and spoke with several of the girls there. I wish they'd hurry, Lavender grumbled. It can't look too obvious, Ginny said as she pushed her plate away and folded her arms on the table. Here comes Luna now, Hermione murmured. Thanks for letting me borrow your notes, Ginny, Luna said, holding out a piece of parchment. My bag was infested with 3-toed glitterbugs, and they left so many tracks on my notes I couldn't read them. 3-toed glitterbugs? Hermione asked, then regretted it. Luna nodded. They're only visible by moonlight during a leap year. Ginny rolled her eyes. Glitterbugs? That's the best you could come up with, she asked quietly. The blonde squirmed a bit. I was in a hurry. Deal with it! Turning, she returned to her table, shaking her head. Ginny looked down at the parchment. She froze for a moment, then quickly slapped a hand over her mouth and shoved Luna's note at Hermione. Taking the parchment, Hermione's lips quirked. Oh, my, she said, then bit her lip. Mind-sharing, Harry said. It seems the girls of Slytherin did a little digging into who caused their unfortunate wardrobe problem yesterday morning. Oh! And who are the responsible parties? Hermione looked up. The Slytherin boys. Ron frowned. But didn't you tell us last night that you and the other girls were the ones who... He broke off when Hermione's eyes went flat and cold. Right. The Slytherin boys are responsible. How? Dean looked between Hermione and Ron and shook his head. So why are the Slytherin boys absent? Apparently the girls got revenge last night, Hermione told him. For Merlin's sake, Hermione Lavender groused. Get to the bloody point. What did the girls do to them? Hermione stared at Ron for a moment. Eastern sand fleas. Ron's jaw dropped. No way! Nodding, she held out the parchment. Ron snatched it from her hand, read it, then began to laugh. Oh, Merlin! I think they've outsmarted themselves this time. What do you mean? Harry asked. Parvati blanched. The boys will have to be deloused, which is a rather painful process, but the girls will, at the very least, have to be examined. You do realize they'll probably fumigate Slytherin House, don't you? Yep, he said cheerfully. Harry began to laugh. If the girls end up having to be examined, they're just going to hate the boys even more. And the boys are sure to figure out that the girls are the ones who did this to them, Seamus said, his eyes wide as he realized what was happening. Dean looked at Hermione, Ginny, Lavender, and Parvati. He stood abruptly and bowed to them. Masterfully done, ladies. Brilliant. You've just removed Slytherin House from the equation. As he sat back down, the girls all preened. Harry looked at Seamus and grinned. Now, do you understand why we do our best not to make them angry at us? Sir Author's notes. For all our wonderful reviewers, there's 80 pounds of various types of cookies, as well as coffee, tea, and other milk. Dig in, folks, and thanks for reading. Bob's note. Sorry, those cookies are mine. Get your own.